The Battle of Red Cliffs, one of the largest naval battles in ancient times, pitted the mighty Han Dynasty against invading forces from across the sea. What makes this battle so remarkable is that it wasn't fought with swords and shields, but with fire. In fact, one of the most iconic images of this battle, a fleet of burning ships sailing straight into the night. So how did these fiery ships come to be? Let's find out in today's episode. As we've mentioned before, China has been a land of many heroes and legendary warriors, such as the Monkey King in Journey to the West and General Yu Deu of the 18 episodes of Liu Bei. But another great tale of valor involves a less familiar name, Zhuge, whose skills as a strategist were just as important to his country's fate as the best sword-wielding generals. In the year 208 AD, the Han Dynasty was under threat. A coalition of other kingdoms had launched an invasion from the south, but their leader was none other than the famous warlord Cao Cao. If you've watched our videos on the Three Kingdoms era, you may already know that Cao Cao was the man responsible for much of the Han Dynasty's woes after it fell into civil war. Although he himself was a member of the Han imperial clan, he declared himself the new emperor and took the title of Duke of Wei. Under his rule, the Han Dynasty became more and more fragile until eventually it would collapse entirely. In the face of this crisis, Sun Quan, the king of the Eastern Wu Kingdom, formed an alliance with Liu Bei, the Prince of Shu, and formed a united front against Cao Cao. The allied army numbered over 30,000 men, including some of the best generals and strategists in China. On the side of Shu, commanded by Liu Bei, was the brilliant tactician Zhuge Liang, who later became the prime minister of Shu, and is best known for his appearance in Romance of the Three Kingdoms. And on the side of Wu, commanded by Sun Quan, was the general and strategist Zhou, who is the protagonist of our story. The allied army met up at a place called the Barrier, which was located near the mouth of the Yangtze River. It was here that they prepared to defend against the coming storm. For his part, Cao Cao had crossed the river and set up camp on the north bank. Although he didn't know it yet, he had sailed right into a trap. That is because the Allies had sent spies to secretly dig a canal from the river to a large lake nearby. This would allow them to flood the north bank and wash away Cao Cao's army. At first, Cao Cao's forces didn't seem worried about the flooding. After all, they had brought siege equipment like catapults and plenty of boats to make sure they could safely navigate the river. Catapults are large devices used to hurl objects, such as rocks or spears, over a wall from a distance. They're often used to batter down a gate or keep an enemy force from getting too close. But in the case of the Battle of the Barrier, the catapults were instead used to smash open the river banks. This made the river wider and deeper and gave Cao Cao's fleet enough room to sail through without damaging their ships. However, there was another problem, namely the heavy rains that were also taking place at the time. The rains lasted for 10 days and were so intense that even if Cao Cao wanted to repair the damage done to his fleet, he couldn't risk setting up camp. So he had no choice but to continue sailing further up the river towards safety. Little did he know that the Allies were still watching him. As soon as the rain stopped, the Allies immediately ordered their own fleet to sail upriver. This fleet consisted of over 900 ships carrying tens of thousands of troops. By now, the allied armies had joined together and formed a solid line across the river. The plan was to use their superior numbers to block off the river and prevent Cao Cao from escaping. However, things weren't going as well as they hoped, since the torrential rains had also damaged their ships. Of the 900 vessels, only 200 were seaworthy. Of course, they could have waited for the rest of the ships to be repaired, but the generals were eager to fight and jumped into action regardless. The moment the two fleets met, the battle began. Arrows flew back and forth and loud battle cries echoed across the water. The fighting was fierce, but the Allies had the advantage. Not only did they have twice as many ships as their opponents, but their generals and strategists were better coordinated. While the battle raged, Zhou directed his men from the top of a flag tower, calmly giving orders and making split-second decisions to ensure victory. With his keen eyesight and sharp intellect, he easily saw what needed to be done. On the other side of the battlefield, Zhuge Liang was doing the same. He and Zhou Yu were like two pieces of a chessboard, each moving in response to the other's moves to ensure the destruction of Cao Cao's forces. By nightfall, the tide had turned, many ships had been destroyed, and the remaining vessels of Cao Cao's fleet were trying to escape. Some fled downstream, but they were trapped by the allied fleet, while others tried to sail upstream, but they were blocked by reefs and rocks. But the deciding factor in the battle came when the allied fleet opened up a path in the middle of their lines. All the ships of the Wu Kingdom flew flags decorated with the head of a red bird. Seeing this, the soldiers on Cao Cao's ships thought that it must be a signal from their lord to retreat. So they dropped anchor and sailed back downstream. However, it wasn't long before they realized that this was a trick. It was just a ploy to lure them into the open waters, where the ships of Shu were waiting to ambush them. And so it was that the fleeing ships found themselves surrounded and defeated again. One by one, the enemy ships were captured or destroyed until finally there were none left. According to historical records, 48 ships belonging to Cao Cao were captured, 78 were sunk, and more than 3,000 soldiers were lost. On the side of the Shu and Wu kingdoms, only 20 ships were lost. Needless to say, this was a great victory for the Allies. In the aftermath of the battle, the surviving members of Cao Cao's fleet scattered and fled. Although the coalition army could have pursued them, they didn't. Instead, they decided to return home and lick their wounds. The reason for this was simple. Despite the enormous victory, both Shu and Wu were suffering from severe shortages of food and supplies. Neither kingdom wanted to waste their resources on pursuing the enemy. It may seem that the Battle of Chibai ended in a stalemate, however, this is not quite true. You see, although Cao Cao had been defeated, he still controlled the northern half of China. On the other hand, the coalition army only held the southern half. To make matters worse, the two allies weren't exactly on good terms. Soon after the battle, hostilities broke out between them, and an alliance that once saved China was broken. One of the main reasons for this was that Liu Bei wanted to expand his territory and power. But he was stopped by Sun Quan. Even though the two had become allies after defeating Cao Cao, they couldn't agree on who should control the rich lands of Jing province, which sat between the territories of Shu and Wu. This disagreement would lead to the Battle of Yiling 10 years later, which would be the last major battle of the Three Kingdoms era. And while the Battle of the Barrier may not have ended the chaos in China, it did serve as a turning point in the war. From then on, Cao Cao's power would never reach south of the Yangtze River again. Hey everyone, thanks for watching today's episode. We hope you learned something new and exciting about Chinese history. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe if you haven't already. And as always, thanks for watching. The Battle of Red Cliffs was one of the most important battles in Chinese history. It is mentioned multiple times in the Romance of the Three Kingdoms and in the Han Dynasty Warriors 8. It's one of the few battles where you can fight alongside Liu Bei, but what was the real-world impact of the battle? Was it really as decisive as it's made out to be? And why did Sun Quan decide to attack Yu Jin right after? Well, let's find out. So the battle happened in the year 208 at the northern shore of the Yangtze River between the warlords Liu Bei, Sun Quan and Liu Zhang on one side and Cao Cao on the other. Cao Cao wanted to invade the south and take more land and resources from the weakening Han Dynasty. So he sent his general Yu Jin to attack the city of Hefei. However, he soon realized that attacking from the north would be very difficult because the terrain was full of mountains and ravines. As he marched down south, his army became fewer and fewer. By the time he arrived at the river, he only had 20,000 troops left. Meanwhile, Sun Quan heard about Yu Jin's invasion and prepared to defend his lands. He sent his general Huang Gai to attack Yu Jin's supply line and disrupt his invasion. Huang Gai ambushed a fleet of transport ships and killed one of Yu Jin's advisors named Le Bu. Enraged, Yu Jin gathered his troops and launched an attack on the next morning. Both sides fought fiercely, but in the end, Huang Gai retreated to the safety of the river. At this point, Yujin thought that he had proven himself by defeating the enemy. And so he decided to return home, thinking that he could just invade another day. But little did he know, Sun Quan had a different plan in mind. Okay, before we continue, now back to the video. That night, Sun Quan held an important meeting with his advisors and generals. They talked about how Yujin had proven to be a strong and capable general, and that if they wanted to invade the north themselves, then they needed to defeat him first. His advisors agreed with him, saying that Yujin had grown to powerful, and that if they didn't do something about it, then their chances of invading the north would become slim to none. Even his sister, Sun Shangxiang, who was married to the future Shi ruler Liu Shan, advised her brother to strike against Yujin and crush him once and for all. And so, despite the fact that many people considered Yujin to be invincible, Sun Quan decided to make him his first target. He personally led 30,000 troops to the north to confront Yujin. At the same time, he ordered Zhou Yu to bring the rest of the army to join him as quickly as possible. Yujin had no idea that Sun Quan was coming for him, and so he spent most of his time drinking and having fun. When he finally heard the news of Sun Quan's arrival, he grabbed his weapons and rushed outside of the camp. The two armies clashed and Sun Quan and Yujin began fighting each other one-on-one. Although Yujin was strong, Sun Quan's troops outnumbered them, and slowly but surely, Yujin's army began to weaken. Despite being outnumbered, though, Yujin refused to retreat and he kept on fighting until he got injured. Once he got hurt, he realized that he was no match for Sun Quan, and so he fled back into the camp. Realizing that there was no hope of winning the battle, Yujin took his own life. With their leader gone, the Jin army panicked and began retreating. Sun Quan chased after them, wanting to finish the battle as quickly as possible. However, his troops grew exhausted, and so he stopped chasing and returned to his camp. The following day, he entered Yejin's camp and found out that the general had already taken his own life. He sighed and ordered for him to be given a proper burial. After doing this, he continued his advance northwards and took several cities along the way. Now, even though the romance of the Three Kingdoms makes it seem like Sun Quan immediately chased after Yujin after hearing about his defeat, in reality, there is no record of this happening. In fact, Sun Quan didn't invade the north again for another 10 years. But why did he do this? After all, Yujin was dead and his army was defeated. Why wait 10 years to invade? Well, there are a couple reasons for this. First of all, although Yujin was defeated and killed, his army wasn't completely destroyed. There were still thousands of soldiers who were able to escape and regroup. Sun Quan knew that if he wanted to invade the north, then he would have to deal with these stragglers, and he didn't want to risk any of his own men getting hurt. So he waited until he had enough troops to deal with them. Secondly, Sun Quan also needed time to recover from the battle. Even though he won, it still took a lot of effort and resources to chase down Yujin and defeat his army. And during this time, he couldn't focus on expanding his territory. Finally, and probably the most important reason, Sun Quan needed time to develop his economy. In order to invade the north, he needed a lot of money and resources. And so he spent the next decade developing trade and collecting taxes to prepare for his invasion. Alright, so now let's talk about the impact of this battle. How did it change the balance of power in China? Well, first of all, it showed that the South was powerful enough to defeat a northern warlord. This gave the southern warlords more confidence and they began expanding their territory more aggressively. For example, in 219, Sun Quan invaded western Hunan and defeated the warlord Liu Zhang. Secondly, the battle also weakened the northern warlords. Yujin was one of the most talented generals in China, and his death was a major blow to Cao Cao. Now, even though Cao Cao would eventually conquer northern China, this victory prevented him from doing it sooner. Finally, the battle also helped to promote trade between the north and the south. Before the battle, most of the trade between the two regions went through the hands of northern warlords. But after the battle, Southern warlords began controlling more and more of the trade routes. All in all, the Battle of Red Cliffs was a very important battle in Chinese history. It helped to shift the balance of power in China, and it paved the way for the eventual conquest of the north by the Three Kingdoms. Finally, let's answer the question I posed in the beginning of the video. Should Sun Quan have attacked Yu Jin after defeating him at Red Cliffs? Well, my opinion is no. I think that Sun Quan made a mistake by chasing after Yu Jin. He should have just consolidated his power in the south and waited to invade the north. Chasing after Yu Jin put a lot of stress on his army and resources, and it didn't really accomplish anything. Well, that's it for today. I hope you enjoyed this video and learned something new. If you did, please be sure to like and subscribe. Thank you all for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. We all know how the battle between the two great rivals of the Three Kingdoms went down. Liu Bei's forces defeated Zhang Song and captured him and his younger brother, Zhang Bao, along with their father, Zhang Lu, the warlord of Hanzhong. And we all know that the former rival turned traitor, Zhang Song, was killed by Liu Bei himself for attempting to defect to Cao Cao right in the middle of the battle. But what if I told you there is a character who plays an even bigger role than Zhao Yun? Yep, that's right. In today's episode, let's talk about the person whose absence nearly caused Liu Bei to lose the battle, the strategist of Shu, Zhou Yu. Let me tell you this. If it wasn't for Zhou Yu, not only would Liu Bei not have been able to defeat Zhang Lu so easily, he might have even lost the battle against him. So let's find out who was this strategist and why was he such an important person. So here's the thing. In most of the Chinese historical dramas based on the romance of the Three Kingdoms, like the 2010 version or the 94 version, the character of Zhou Yu is portrayed as a cunning, scheming and slightly cowardly strategist who had a knack for coming up with creative ways to trick his opponents. Even his death was shown in a very disgraceful manner, which was a result of his inability to understand the true intentions of his master, Zhuge Liang. But the real Zhou Yu was far different from his fictional counterpart. If anything, his skills were way better. He was the one who came up with the idea of burning the chibi, which eventually led to the downfall of Cao Cao's forces in the Battle of the Red Cliffs. His military knowledge was also top-notch, comparable to the likes of Zhuge Liang, and he was also a very good judge of people too. Otherwise, he wouldn't have been able to see through the potential of a young strategist named Zhuge Liang and recommend him to Liu Bei despite the latter's shabby appearance. Even after joining Liu Bei, it was Zhou Yu who took the charge of training his military forces. It was because of him that Liu Bei's army was able to stand toe-to-toe with the combined forces of Zhang Song and Zhao Zhang. But then why was he absent during the final battle against Zhang Lu? Well, to answer that, we need to go back a bit. You see, ever since Liu Bei managed to secure the land of Shu, he tried everything in his power to get his hands on the fertile lands of Jing and Yi, which were ruled by the warlords Liu Zhang and Sun Quan respectively. Although Liu Bei's main focus was Zhang Lu, whom he considered to be a threat to the security of Shu, he didn't want to let the opportunity slip away to take the Jing and Yi region under his banner as well. So he decided to launch a campaign against Liu Zhang first while dealing with Zhang Lu at the same time. This put a lot of burden on Zhou Yu, who had to come up with a plan that would ensure their victory against both the enemies. It was because of his brilliant strategies that Liu Bei's army was able to defeat Zhang Song and capture him. But unfortunately, he fell seriously ill right before the final battle against Zhang Lu and had to return to Chengdu, the capital of Shu, for treatment. Now, some people might say, well, if he was sick, then he probably just took a break due to health concerns, but that's not the case here. You see, according to the records, when Zhou Yu was taking his leave from the army, he expressed his desire to die on the battlefield rather than living a life without honor. So clearly, it was not an option for him to just stay behind in Chengdu and do nothing. And that's where the story of Huang Changyin comes into play. You might ask, who the hell is that? Well, Huang Changyin was a strategist working under Zhonglu, who was known for his ability to predict the outcome of battles by merely looking at the flags and banners of the opposing forces. Not only that, he was also responsible for convincing Zhang Lu to form an alliance with Cao Cao against Liu Bei, saying that the latter had no intention of returning the Jing province to Liu Zhang after the war. But Huang Changyin's biggest claim to fame came in the battle between Liu Bei and Zhang Lu, when he correctly predicted that Liu Bei's forces would win despite being outnumbered. That's right, before the battle began, Huang Changyin looked at the flags and banners of Liu Bei's army and declared that the Shu army would win no matter what. When Zhang Lu heard that, he wanted to cancel the battle, but he was forced by his subordinate, Zhang Song, to fight against Liu Bei. It was only after Liu Bei's victory that Huang Changyin revealed the reason for his prediction. According to him, the reason why Liu Bei won was because he had a sage-like strategist with him, which was none other than Zhou Yu. Huang Changyin had already heard about Zhou Yu's reputation by then, so he was certain that if he was able to capture him, he would become the greatest strategist in the Three Kingdoms. So immediately after the battle, he sent a letter to Zhang Lu, asking for 300 elite soldiers so that he could ambush Zhou Yu and bring him to their side. But Zhang Lu refused to accept his request, saying that capturing Zhou Yu would not be an easy task. Although he trusted his strategist's judgment, he knew very well that the Shu army also had some brilliant tacticians like Zhuge Liang, so he ordered Huang Changyin to just forget about bringing Zhou Yu to their side and instead focus on defending the Han River. But Huang Changyin was not a man to back down easily. So he secretly took 100 elite soldiers and set off to ambush Zhou Yu while he was returning to Chengdu. But unfortunately for him, he never got the chance to meet Zhou Yu. You see, when Zhou Yu was on his way back, he got attacked by a band of robbers. Although he managed to kill them all, he lost a lot of his belongings in the process, including the seal of the military advisor. When this news reached Liu Bei, he immediately dispatched his men to protect Zhou Yu for the rest of the journey. And as you can imagine, Huang Changyin's ambush failed as soon as he learned about it. However, he didn't give up. He again requested Zhang Lu to send him 300 elite soldiers, but this time he made it clear that he would personally lead them and not return until he brought Zhou Yu back dead or alive. Zhang Lu had no choice but to agree to his request. So he gave Huang Changyin what he asked for and sent him on his way. And now we come to the part where the legendary strategist Zhuge Liang steps into the picture. As Huang Changyin and his men were moving through the forest, they came across a small village and decided to rest there for a bit. Unbeknownst to them, Zhuge Liang was traveling to the same village to treat some sick villagers. When he entered the village, he noticed that the houses were locked from the inside and there was no sign of anyone living there. Confused by this, he decided to take a look around, and that's when he came across Huang Changyin and his men resting by a well. Zhuge Liang politely greeted him and inquired about the reason for his presence in the village. In response, Huang Changyin simply replied that he was tired from the journey and needed some rest. Zhuge Liang, however, was not convinced by his answer, so he decided to test him. He asked a few riddles, and each time Huang Changyin failed to solve them, he grew more suspicious of his intentions. Eventually, Zhuge Liang threatened to take his head if he didn't reveal the truth. Huang Changyin had no choice but to confess everything. When Zhuge Liang learned about his plan to capture Zhou Yu, he unleashed a tirade of insults on him, calling him a treacherous, narrow-minded and spineless strategist. Offended by his words, Huang Changyin challenged him to a game of chess and boasted that he would cut off his own head if he lost. Zhuge Liang accepted the challenge, but he made it clear that if he won, Huang Changyin would have to serve him for 3 years without pay. Huang Changyin agreed to these terms and sat down to play. But little did he know he had walked right into Zhuge Liang's trap. The latter quickly offered him wine and food and pretended to get drunk. On the other hand, he kept playing chess in such a way that Huang Changyin always ended up winning. When the time came for Huang Changyan to cut off his head, Zhuge Liang woke up as if from a dream and revealed that he had tricked him. He then tied up Huang Changyan and his men and sent them to Liu Bei, who rewarded Zhuge Liang with a noble title and granted him 300 soldiers, which were previously under Huang Changyan's command. As for Huang Changyan, his life was spared, but he had to serve Liu Bei for 3 years without any salary, just as he had promised. Now, you must be wondering, did Zhou Yu ever come to know about this incident? Yes, he did. And it is believed that he was quite happy to hear about it because finally he didn't have to worry about his friend Zhuge Liang anymore. A lot of people consider the meeting between Zhuge Liang and Huang Changyan to be one of the most exciting confrontations in the entire novel. If you think the same, let us know in the comments below. And if you enjoyed watching this video, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe for more amazing content. Thanks for watching. Hey guys, what is up? It's me here and welcome back to my channel. Today we're going to talk about one of the most important battles in history, specifically in terms of its effect on global geopolitics, the Battle of Red Cliffs. Now, this was a battle that took place in 208 AD, where a coalition of forces led by the warlord Liu Bei and Sun Quan took on the might of the newly reunified kingdom of Wei. It's often considered to be one of the turning points of the Three Kingdoms period in China, which in turn has had an enormous impact on how things would go for the next few decades. And it's also been mythologized and made into an epic poem by Luo Guanzhong, who also wrote the Romance of the Three Kingdoms. And while there have been many videos done on this topic before, ranging from Total War to other places, there is one aspect of the Battle of Red Cliffs that I haven't really heard anyone else talking about yet, at least not in a video form, and that is the use of fire ships, which played a critical role in securing victory for the coalition forces. So today we are going to talk about the fire ships used during the Battle of Red Cliffs. How were they used and why were they so important? Let's find out. So first of all, I should probably explain the basics of the battle itself, including why it was being fought in the first place. So basically, as the game and the show implies, towards the end of the Han Dynasty, the central government became increasingly corrupt and ineffective, leading to massive tax burdens on the people as well as constant warfare along the empire's borders. The warlords at this time were called princes, and there were many who sought to carve out their own territories and claim the mandate of heaven for themselves. One such warlord was the infamous Cao Cao, who sought to conquer the entire south. But he faced fierce resistance from the other local powers, including the kingdoms of Shu, Han, and Wu. Over time, these three allied with each other to resist against the growing threat of Wei, and they came to be known as the Three Kingdoms. And this alliance would eventually lead to the Battle of Red Cliffs. In 208 AD, Cao Cao led his army south along the Yangtze River towards the heartland of the Kingdom of Wu, but he soon found himself engaged in a fierce battle with the combined forces of Sun Quan and his sister Sun Shangxiang as husband, the warlord Liu Bei, and so this is how the battle began. The main engagement of the battle took place at a place called the Red Cliff, which is located near the modern city of Yichang in Hubei province. Both sides were evenly matched, with Wei having more soldiers and Shu and Wu having better generals. For instance, there were the brilliant tacticians Zhuge Liang and Zhou Yu, as well as the peerless archer, the legendary Guan Yu. Now, even though the odds were pretty equal, both sides knew that they needed some kind of advantage if they were going to prevail. And so they looked for any way they could find to get it. And this is when the fire ships would come into play. You see, for the coalition forces of Shu and Wu, they had an ace up their sleeve, a secret weapon that gave them a significant advantage over their enemies, superior knowledge of river warfare. This was due to the fact that they had spent much of their time fighting in the marshlands and river deltas along the Yangtze, while the Wei army was primarily a land-based force that was used to fighting on open plains. This meant that they were at a disadvantage when trying to navigate the winding rivers and small waterways around the Red Cliffs. And this is where the fire ships came in. The use of fire ships dates back thousands of years and has been employed by many different cultures throughout history. In general, they were used as a way to deliver a surprise attack by catching the enemy off guard. Fire ships were also used to sow panic and disorder among the enemy ranks, especially since in ancient times, fire was very difficult to control and could easily spread out of control. Of course, fire ships were also used to actually set fire to enemy vessels, either to destroy them or to drive their crews into the water. But in the case of Red Cliffs, they were used primarily as a psychological weapon. As the battle began, the Shu and Wu armies had already managed to inflict several defeats on the Wei army, causing them to fall back in a disorderly retreat along the river. But despite this, Cao Cao still felt confident that he could win the battle. However, he soon found out that he had severely underestimated his opponents because just as the Wei army was preparing to regroup and make a counterattack, they suddenly came under fire from two directions. You see, the Shu and Wu forces had launched a surprise attack on their camp, and they did so by using a fleet of fast, maneuverable boats that were hidden in the marshes around Red Cliff. These boats were sleek and swift, making them difficult for the Wei army to detect or intercept. And once they got close enough to the shore, they began hurling blazing projectiles into the camp, setting fire to tents and panicking the Wei soldiers inside. Now, the reason why this tactic was so effective was because it completely caught the Wei army off guard. They had been expecting an attack from the river, but they had no idea that their enemies were hiding in the marshes. This caused complete havoc among their ranks, since they didn't know where the attacks were coming from or how to defend themselves against them. As the fire spread through the camp, the Wei soldiers panicked and began running for the hills, only to find themselves under attack from the Shu boats on the river as well. They were trapped and had nowhere to go. Now, according to the records, there were many types of fire ships used in this battle, but they can be broken down into four main categories, each with their own unique purpose and method of operation. The first type was the simplest and most common, and it was essentially just a boat filled with flammable materials that would be paddled up alongside enemy ships and then set on fire. The second type was more sophisticated because it involved a hollow tube filled with burning material that was attached to a long pole and then thrust through the openings of enemy ships to set them ablaze from the inside. The third type was a bit more complex because it involved a watertight chamber in the middle of a boat, which would hold a mixture of resin and cloth that would burn for a long time. This chamber would then be detached from the main ship and allowed to drift down the river towards enemy vessels, where it would either be dropped directly onto them or thrown in using a hook. The fourth and final type was the most advanced and dangerous because it involved a large boat filled with explosives that would be deliberately crashed into enemy vessels to cause massive damage. This type of attack was very risky, however, because if it failed to ignite the target ship, then it could potentially blow up in the face of the attacker. But in the end, it didn't really matter what kind of fire ships were used because the overall result was the same. The Wei army was completely routed and forced to flee down the river, abandoning their equipment and supplies behind them. This marked the end of the Battle of Red Cliffs and secured a great victory for the coalition forces of Shu, Wu, and Han. In the aftermath of the battle, Liu Bei and Sun Quan would go on to establish their kingdoms, which would eventually become the dominant powers in the region. And the use of fire ships would continue to be an important part of their navies for many years to come. Overall, the Battle of Red Cliffs was a decisive moment in Chinese history, and the use of fire ships played a critical role in securing victory for the coalition forces. It demonstrated the importance of adapting to new situations and using unconventional tactics to defeat a more powerful enemy. And so that's it for this episode. I hope you enjoyed learning about the role of fire ships in the Battle of Red Cliffs. If you did, please be sure to leave me a like and maybe even subscribe if you want to see more videos like this in the future. And if you want to learn more about the events leading up to the Battle of Red Cliffs, I highly recommend reading The Romance of the Three Kingdoms, which is an epic novel that tells the story of the Three Kingdoms period in China. It is considered one of the four great classical novels of Chinese literature, and it is full of action, adventure, and intrigue. You can read it online for free, or you can check out the movie adaptations if you prefer. Anyway, thank you for watching, stay safe, and I'll see you next time. Bye. Hey guys, welcome back to another episode of The History Guy, and today we're gonna be talking about a location debate, the location of the Battle of the Red Cliffs. Now, I know what some of you are saying, but I love location debates, to each their own. But for me personally, one of the most fascinating things about ancient history is just trying to piece together where the heck did stuff happen. It's always an interesting sort of puzzle. This is not a puzzle that many people have tried to solve. However, because this is one of the better known locations in all of ancient history. But even so, there are still a few details to be worked out here, so let's talk about it. So if you're not familiar with the Battle of the Red Cliffs, it was this famous battle between the Chinese warlord Liu Bei and the forces of the state of Wu, along with Sun Quan's adopted sister, the famous Chinese noblewoman Zhuge, and her husband, the famous Chinese general Liang. Now, if you want to learn more about the battle itself, there is a fantastic series on the Battle of the Red Cliffs by a historian named Chris Baca that I will link down below. It's a great series and it goes into a lot more detail than I will here. I will also be doing a 3-part series on the Battle of the Red Cliffs next year, which will be released on my Patreon. So if you'd like to support me and get early access to my videos and other exclusive content, consider becoming a patron. Today, we are not talking about the battle itself, but rather where it took place. As far as I can tell, there are really only 2 places that people believe the battle took place, but there's a lot of disagreement about which one it was. One person who believed they knew where the battle took place was Shiba Yoshihiko, a Japanese historian who spent a great deal of time in China in the first half of the 20th century. Shiba visited many of the sites connected to the Three Kingdoms, and he identified a number of archaeological sites that he believed were connected to the battle. Shiba claimed that the battle took place at Mount Guko near the city of Anqing. He based this identification on a number of pieces of information, including an identification of the Wujin or Wuzhong that appears in some versions of the Romance of the Three Kingdoms with the modern city of Anqing. Another piece of evidence he used to identify this site was a description of the terrain from Chapter 18 of the Romance of the Three Kingdoms, which reads, "The mountains on the left of the allied army were high and steep, and there were no paths up them. Those on the right were low and could all be climbed. In front of the camp was a plain, level and open, and behind it lay marshes, deep and without outlet." Shiba argued that this description fit best with the geography around Anqing. And after visiting the area himself, he came to the conclusion that the only place it could have been was at Mount Guko. Most historians agree that Shiba was correct in identifying the general area in which the battle took place. But there is much debate over whether or not Mount Guko is the exact location of the battle. Many historians have come to that conclusion because of a line in Chapter 17 of the Romance of the Three Kingdoms that says that the armies camped on the southeastern shore of the Yangtze River. That would seem to indicate that the battle happened somewhere near the mouth of the Yangtze. However, the passage from the 18th chapter that I read earlier clearly indicates that the army of Liu Bei was located on the northern shore of the river, facing the armies of Sun Quan and Zhuge across the way. So perhaps the passage in the 17th chapter is referring to an earlier point in the story when the allied army is still grouped together on the south side of the river before they split up. Or maybe the armies crossed the river at some point before the battle started. But anyway, there are ways to make sense of this apparent discrepancy, and that's why most historians argue that the battle very likely took place near Anqing. There is also a Chinese novel called The Three Kingdoms Yani Ju, or The Complete Records of the Three Kingdoms, which contains a much more detailed description of the topography of the battlefield, including some maps. And according to this novel, the Allies set up their headquarters at a place called Xi'an, which is near Guko Mountain. Unfortunately, this text was written many centuries after the battle took place, so its value as a historical source is questionable. It might just be repeating what the Romance of the Three Kingdoms said. It's possible that the battle took place a little farther west than Mount Zhuge. There was a battle at or near the modern city of Zhuge, which may have been part of the Battle of the Red Cliffs. There is a passage in the records of the Three Kingdoms that describes a battle that took place on the upper reaches of the Yangtze River. This has led some scholars to believe that the battle took place farther north near Zhuge. Another problem with the identification of Mount Zhuge is that none of the famous generals of the battle buried anywhere nearby. For instance, the tomb of Liu Bei is located near the modern city of Nanjing, quite a distance away from Mount Zhuge. Some people have suggested that the reason for this is that the battle didn't actually take place at Mount Zhuge. Instead, some people have suggested that the battle took place at a place called Poyang, which is pretty close to where Liu Bei is buried. There is one other small piece of evidence that has been put forward to argue against the identification of Mount Zhuge, but it is very weak evidence indeed. The Japanese historian Eiji Yasaki published a book in 1937 arguing that the battle took place at a place called Zhuge, which is on the other side of the Yangtze River from Poyang. His reasoning is that the Battle of Zhuge cannot have taken place at Mount Zhuge because Zhuge literally means west of the river in Chinese. Therefore, it could not have been the location of the battle because the armies would have been fighting against each other across the river. This argument is absolutely absurd. However, because the name Zhuge doesn't mean west of the river, it means West Gate. Many cities and geographical features in China have names like this that describe the direction that they are located relative to some other place. For instance, there's Beiping, which literally means north of the city. But that doesn't mean that the city isn't located in the north. It just means that it's located to the north relative to some other place, so this argument is easily dismissed. But as far as the actual identification of the location, I think there is a strong case to be made for both Mount Zhuge and Poyang. They're pretty close to each other anyway. Maybe the battle wasn't localized to one place. Maybe it was a series of battles that took place over a wide area. We don't really know. Perhaps future archaeological discoveries will shed more light on the issue. But until then, if you had to guess where I stand on the issue, I'm probably closer to thinking that the battle took place near Poyang. If you want to see more episodes about the Battle of the Red Cliffs, stay tuned. Like I said, I plan on making a 3-part series on it next year. Thanks for watching.